So this is the last part of the lecture for Chapter 9, okay? So we have already examined how people work together to make decisions. In these situations, group members have a common goal. Well, what happens when goals collide? Often people have incompatible goals, which creates conflict, and this may happen at any level. It may happen between individuals, groups, organizations, or nations. So certain factors will decide whether these conflicts get resolved or escalate, okay? So an example, counseling is a way that conflicts get resolved peacefully often. Perhaps if a couple is contemplating divorce because of their differences, they may decide not to, they may be able to resolve their differences through counseling, or they may at least decide to have an amicable divorce. Either way, psychologists have assisted them with resolving their conflict peacefully. So social psychologists have looked at a lot of different ways to resolve conflicts and have used a lot of different experimental designs to do that. So one way that they've done research is to look at the nature of the conflict. So a lot of times social psychologists will look at what's called social dilemmas. And these are dilemmas in which the most beneficial action for an individual will, if chosen by most people, be harmful for everybody, okay? So for example, Stephen King, the writer, was trying to do a book installment online. He wrote 2 installments of a novel called The Plant and posted them on the internet and asked readers to pay $1 per installment. And so the deal he offered was simple. If at least 75% of the people who downloaded the installments paid the $1 fee, he would keep writing and posting new installments. But if fewer than 75% of the people paid, he would stop writing and no one would ever get the rest of the novel. So this was a classic social dilemma, a conflict in which the most beneficial action for an individual, which was to not pay the $1, if chosen by most people, would be harmful to everyone. So at first it worked great. More than 75% of the people paid for the first installment. As though with many social dilemmas, people eventually acted in their own self-interest, and this was to the detriment of all. The number of people who paid for their later installments dropped below the 75% threshold, and King stopped posting new installments, stating that the novel was on a hiatus, right? Panera Cares Cafes is another example of this classic social dilemma. They wanted to, actually they did open 5 Panera Cares Cafes where people could pay whatever they wanted to for their meals. But because enough people didn't pay, the restaurants could not survive financially. They couldn't break even. So they closed and then everyone lost out. So some models like this, some other restaurant models have worked, but this particular one did not. And it became an example of a social dilemma, okay? So if we think in terms of other social dilemmas, we can think in terms of game theory. There is something called the prisoner's dilemma, which we'll discuss in just a minute. There's been a lot of research based on the prisoner's dilemma. There's also a public goods dilemma, and there's also what's called the tragedy of the commons, okay? Now, if I had y'all in the classroom with me, we could actually act out a prisoner's dilemma, but we can't do it because we're not in the classroom, sadly, but we can at least talk about the prisoner's dilemma. In the prisoner's dilemma game, you have 2 prisoners, prisoner A and prisoner B, and they both can make 2 decisions. They cannot talk to each other, but prisoner A can either confess or not confess. If he confesses, then he's basically ratting out prisoner B. And why would he confess? Because he gets an offer of leniency if he confesses. And I have written here that he then is defecting, right? Because he's ratting out prisoner B. And prisoner B has the same options as prisoner A. If he confesses and basically rats out prisoner A, then he'll get a shorter sentence, or prisoner B will get prisoner A will get a longer sentence, right? So if both of them don't confess, then they'll both get this lightest sentence, okay? They'll each only serve 1 year because there won't be enough evidence against either one of them for a longer sentence. If they both confess, then they're each going to serve a longer sentence of 2 years, right? Because they're both going to put up evidence against each other. So, so how do we resolve this conflict? Well, people have to, what the best way to resolve it is that prisoner A and prisoner B must trust each other. But often this doesn't happen when people are in these dilemmas. Often people don't have that trust. And so everyone ends up losing out in the end. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about how we might see that play out, or how we could increase cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma. We could either try and trust each other, or we could try what's called a tit-for-tat strategy. And that's first acting cooperatively, but then always responding the way your opponent does, or the way your opponent did on the previous trial. And they might catch on to your pattern, and that might come out positively for each of you. In the public goods dilemma, everybody gives to the common good, and that would be like if everybody had paid their lunches in the Panera Cares Cafe. In the tragedy of the commons dilemma, this is if everyone takes from the common good, then where there's not going to be anything left. And this is things such as if the sheep ate all the grass, there'll be no grass left for any sheep. If everybody drives a Hummer, then there won't be any natural resources left for everyone to drive the Hummer, because it'll all get we'll all use up all of our global resources. So the tragedy of the commons is a resource depletion problem, right? And there's a limited resource. There's grass that's limited in the sheep example, or there's global resources that are limited in the Hummer example. And if an individual if all the individuals use up it individually, then the group will be lost. Then it's no longer available for anyone. Okay. So if we think about negotiation and bargaining, which are other solutions to resolve these dilemmas, we do see some positive ways to resolve dilemmas using negotiation. Okay, this is just a way of communicating in which each side offers something. So there's offers and counter offers, and then a solution is agreed upon when. And that ends the negotiation. So people in conflict often feel that only one person can come out ahead. So often you have to come up with what's called an integrative solution. And this is a solution to a conflict whereby the parties make trade-offs, as we just mentioned, on issues according to their different interests. And each side then is making concessions on issues that are less important to them but are more important to the other side. And in that fashion, we're able to come up with an integrative solution. So that's all we're going to worry about when we think about negotiations and solutions in this chapter. And there's some other material in the chapter, but that I'm not as worried about covering, and not as worried about you learning. And so that will be things, for instance, like there's a tiny bit of the chapter on using threats for resolving conflicts, and basically how that doesn't work. And basically that's really all you need to know about that. All right, so I encourage you to take the little quizzes that I'm going to post as well on our iCollege page to help reinforce what you've heard in these lectures, and as well I need you to go back and make sure you read the chapters. All right, thank you.